Welcome back, everyone. Over to you, Christina.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the panel session called Don't Jump to Solutions, Building a Business Case for DAM. Before we get started talking about building a business case for DAM, we're just going to do a round of intros so that you can meet all of the lovely panelists and us moderators. So just to start, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kristina Huddart. I'm an independent DAM consultant that helps companies and cultural heritage organizations, like some of the ones that I've shown here on the right-hand side, to find, implement, and make the most of their digital asset management practices. I've been working in the DAM industry for over 9 years now. And I'm also really proud to be teaching Henry Stewart courses. If you're interested in change management, we do have a change management course coming up in March, so keep an eye out for that. And I'm also on the faculty of the Rutgers University DAM Professional Certificate Program, where I teach DAM for GLAM. So all of you, of course, being in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, hello, and come check us out at the Rutgers University DAM Professional Certificate Program. Over to you, David.
Christina, thanks so much, and thanks for helping to put this together. I first met Christina when she was at Kew Gardens, and I had the privilege under her leadership to get one heck of a tour, including the Seed Repository, an amazing Victorian building full of what the great British explorers brought back to us, and quite the taxonomy to explain it. Christina's had a lot of works in cultural heritage, so when she asked me to help pitch into this, I was delighted. Thanks, Christina.
Lovely. All right, so as an organization, you will definitely be approached, emailed, and pursued with all sorts of technology solutions, probably also in your personal life. And some of them might be absolutely useless, and some of them might be pretty great. I don't know where you sit on the avocado slicer, but that's a discussion for another time, whether this is a useless object or something that's really useful. But you will be approached over time by a lot of DAM vendors, or you might hear that your other museum partners have a DAM, and you will start to think, okay, maybe we need one of those. But this can get very complicated very quickly because there are hundreds of suppliers out there who are doing some variation of DAM. But not all technology is created equally or created to solve the problems that you specifically want to fix in your organization. And I would add, not all problems should be solved with technology. Sometimes you can do an awful lot by improving your processes, getting the right people involved, and setting up the right governance and data structures. So don't be distracted with the shiny new toys like this avocado slicer.
Christina, I think we need your screen to be shared.
Oh no.
We're seeing you.
I'm so
and the
sorry.
Chesapeake Bay back there, but not your slides.
I'm so sorry.
There we go. Okay, all set.
All right. I'm sorry, that means you didn't see our bio slides, but anyway, here's the beautiful avocado slicer I've been talking about. And we also have this little comic here, cartoon here that says, my team has created a very innovative solution and we're still looking for a problem to go with it. And this is something that I think we all get distracted with in our daily lives is, oh, look at this new technology. Oh, look at this shiny thing over here. And today we want to really flip that on its head and talk about the problems before we talk about solutions. So David and I want to talk with our fabulous panelists today about considering our problems first, who will be using this solution, and what aligns with the organization's strategic goals before we choose a solution. Over to you, David, before we intro all of the panelists.
Thanks. Well, I think setting this context where we're looking at what are the mission and mandates of our organizations, We work in a world that's measured in the GLAM area, in the GLAM arena, that's measured by the services we provide, the missions we accomplish, and the mandates that we're here to achieve through our charters. And it's so different than the world of profit and loss. We tie, we mark, and we measure what we do against mission and mandate. And it's part of the intrigue as to how we think about starting the dam journey and making good progress on securing this to happen. And we've got three great perspectives on that. Christina?
Lovely. All right. So to start us off, Doria, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Doria Hughes. I'm the archivist and collections manager for the Rosemary Beck Foundation, which is a very, very tiny little nonprofit that is physically, our collection that is physically located in Lower Manhattan. I am physically located in Greater Boston in Massachusetts, and different board members and other members of our organization are located in other areas. So we we encountered, we've been sort of working through how to work remotely in the way that everybody has before the pandemic and after, and I'm excited to sort of talk about how our journey has taken shape in that way.
Great. Thank you, Doria. And thank you so much for joining us today. And then we'd like to introduce Yvonne.
Hi, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Yvonne Lee. I'm the head of integrated systems at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. And I've been in this role for about 7 months. And so if you may be wondering if you are familiar at all with the Huntington as a cultural heritage institution and research institution, you may be wondering how perhaps our institution fits under the rubric of being a small or medium-sized institution. But really, I'm hoping that the perspective that I can bring to this panel is about how 3 siloed collecting divisions are now able to identify and work together as one Huntington through the use of systems, policies, working groups, et cetera. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, Margaret.
Hi. Yes, I'm Margaret McKee. I'm the digital asset manager at the Menil Collection in Houston. And I included some facts on my slide about the Menil just to give people an idea of the scale that we're looking at. We have a permanent collection of over 18,000 objects, and we have a very active exhibitions program, and we actively collect new works. And I've been at the Menil 7 years now, and we're currently implementing our first dams.
Amazing. So we've got a lot of great stories to tell from everybody today. But as we get into the beginning of the panel, I will just skip back to the first slide so that apologies again for not having shown this. There we go. So now you can see who all's here and where we're from. And then I'll switch off shortly. So just to intro the session. So this session's all about building a business case for a dam at smaller organizations. And for some smaller organizations that are joining us today that are maybe a little bit less formal, the concept of a business case might be relatively new. So we just want to lay the groundwork and make sure that we are all using the same terminology. So let's talk a little bit about what is a business case and why is it important? And I've just pulled a definition for a business case, a generic definition that just says a business case provides justification for undertaking a project or program, and it usually includes elements such as benefits, costs, and risks of alternative options, and provides a rationale for the preferred solution. So if we start with that as a kind of the basics, that might not be how all of you define a business case. So let's just take a run through and talk about what you would consider a business case and why it's been important. Should we start with Yvonne?
Sure. So let's see. A business case for me, I thought of it rather informally as just what is it that we're trying to do as an institution. It really doesn't, at its start, it really doesn't need to be any more complicated. And in fact, it's probably best if you start out that way, I would say. And so for us, a business case really was simply, what are we trying to achieve? Like, what is the thing? Not even getting into solutions, again, the systems, the roles, the policies in place, none of that. What are we trying to do? And for us at the Huntington, it really was having a sense of our many collections at a glance, in a place where everything is consolidated and we are able to compare and contrast. So it really was, we kept it simple. So.
Love that. Always keep it simple, and definitely at smaller organizations. Very good advice. Margaret, what was it like at your organization?
Yeah, I think in my experience, I haven't heard the term business case used a lot in a museum context, but then I realized, oh, I have written these, and I think a lot of people in our audience have, because it's essentially, defining a problem and identifying potential solutions, their pros and cons, risks, costs, timeline. And I think that in my experience, whenever I've written something like that, a key element to me is identifying what you recommend as the next steps. Because a lot of times things will sort of get murky and get lost, and it's kind of good to be able to go back to that thing you wrote and what were we going to do next?
Yeah, great idea. And Doria, do you have anything to add about business cases
Yeah.
and why they might be important?
Yeah, that was a new term for me as well, but it's useful to think about that. I think for my organization, a lot of what it always ends up being for me is just going back to our mission and looking, because our mission really helps, and I think this is true for all nonprofits, of course. The mission really helps to define and kind of keep you focused on really what you need to be doing above all. And for us, in our case, it was really about making our artwork accessible and visible, so that people can actually see it. And it's as simple, it sounds really, really simple, but it turns out that's a big, big challenge, or it was a really, really big challenge. It remains a big challenge, but digitization and going in the DAMS direction has helped enormously with that. So yeah, we did a lot of brainstorming, the board and I, just to kind of get there. But we pretty much got to what we needed fairly soon. Speed was of the essence. We were under that kind of pressure. We really had to get going.
Yeah, and sometimes documentation, like a business case, doesn't really happen, especially when you are working at speed like that. And so I'm interested to hear from all of you about what format that took, because like you said, maybe that was a conversation, maybe that was a brainstorming workshop, or Margaret, was it just a discussion or presentation? Like, how did you go about doing this?
I think at the Manila, it goes back to like 2008, before I was here. Our head of IT had written up kind of a brief of issues that he noticed that were happening across the organization with images, and on the strength of that summary that he wrote up, they hired a consultant to come in, because we didn't have the in-house expertise to do further analysis. So a consultant came in and gave some recommendations. And then, Christina, you were talking about how sometimes it's a technology solution and sometimes it isn't. So I think that there have been lots of steps made on the non-technology components of what needed to happen. And so, it's been a long journey. And most recently in 2019 to 2020, our archivist and we started interviewing people about, getting a fresh look at everyone's needs. And we wrote up a summary of our key findings from those interviews. We coded all the interviews and wrote up a summary that then that was basically our most recent business case for how we thought we should move forward at this point.
Great. Any other different formats that are maybe a little bit out of the ordinary?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And actually, I love the way that you described that, Margaret, because it happened very differently at the Huntington. I would say that there was a working group sort of first and foremost, and that they had been meeting to discuss different things that were related somehow to this larger issue of digitization access to our collections and platforms, right, systems. And so there were meticulous documentation, like notes, we are a library, sort of most famously, or an independent research library. And so we have really beautiful, detailed minutes going back almost 10 years, documenting what these are. And it's interesting to hear what you just said about the things that'll actually go ahead and move the needle forward in this particular case, because the discussions were lengthy and very comprehensive, and yet that next step sometimes remains somewhat hidden. And so I think that that's where perhaps a consultant, which is the route that we also ended up taking, was really beneficial to say, okay, so it sounds like we're having somewhat circular conversations here. Perhaps this is the next step going forward, and it'll help put everything else in place, because otherwise it's a rather sort of large amorphous problem. Again, going back to issues of digitization, access, systems, technical skills and know-how and roles and, employee requisitions and sort of all of that kind of stuff that we're familiar with. But it really was sort of putting it down in a place where it was really apparent, almost like a RACI chart, who was responsible, who was accountable, who is the decision maker, what needs to happen next. And so I think that that's one of the tools that was used early and often and continues to be useful in sort of thinking about, well, what is the next step as we are just completing our selection process and looking to begin configuration. So.
I hear that. I've had situations where everyone in the room is nodding their head and saying, yes, a great idea. Yes, a great idea.
Exactly.
Then, okay, who's making the decision?
And Yvonne, you just mentioned something very interesting about going back to the document, I don't know if I should say document or process, but that it's a living experience. It's an ongoing experience. And Christina, you worked at several cultural heritage organizations, and you've continued to advise many. I wondered if you might reflect on that, and then about the persistence of the need to visit. Why did we do this? And how did we do this? And are we meeting our goals? And I'd love to hear from Doria and Margaret on that same idea about cadence once the decision has been made.
Yeah, what I find is that institutional memory, when it comes to why did we pick that technology, is very, very short, kind of goldfish level memory. And so it's really useful to have that documentation, even some information about, like Margaret said, about what came out of the interviews and what stakeholders were feeling and thinking originally, that you can go back to and show people a year into the process or 2 years into the process, because they won't remember what they felt like. And a lot of people are joining. There's turnover, there's new people joining the organization. And particularly when that's a new executive, and they say, why do we have a dam? Or why do we have a collection management system? You really need to be able to explain that. And it's helpful to have all that justification written down in one place so you can hand over the documentation or at least refer back to it when you have those conversations. And that, to me, is one of the most useful parts of having that. What have you all found?
A paper trail is always a good thing. And interestingly, in our case, we have, there's a physical paper trail, as well as increasingly a little bit more of a digital trail. I think our path has been increasingly a hybrid one. As I see it, everything we do, I try and think hybrid, which is just considering the analog as well as the digital at all times, and trying to, it's not exactly seamless, I wouldn't say, but there's ways to kind of work and weave within both worlds, so to speak. Whether it's a digital exhibition, that's also something that people can look at physically, or whether, considering different elements of the artwork, how you're looking at it, whether it's online or whether people are visiting it in person, just in everything we've done, including keeping track of our assets and our collection. I feel like it's been really important to consider both sides at all times. So it's a very hybrid mentality. And for me, as a Gen Xer, I feel like I'm perfectly positioned to kind of straddle that divide because my brain is still very kind of rooted in analog processes and just kind of looking at things in that kind of a very physical layout, and then sort of translating that into digital. I find that I'm often moving pieces around on a board digitally, just because that helps with my process. So that's a big way of how I work that out. And a lot of people on my board are a lot older, so trying to sell digital at first was a little bit scary for them, but they quickly moved out of the way and let it happen, and they've been happy with the results. So I kind of feel like we're just going to kind of keep going in this direction, and that's how
Doria,
it's
on
evolved.
in the conversations that you had, with the size of the institution where you work, you've shared with us in some of our earlier calls that you did work very closely with your board. Were there board members who helped with and I don't mean the word help simplistically, were there board members who had insight into what we've used, or euphemistically we'll just say the business case, but who were saying, this is how we do this? Or was it a different kind of board? And it's also quite a curiosity for the Menil and for the Huntington, which have some pretty extraordinary board members on each of their boards. And it's a question I'd like to pass around, because so many times board members are, well, of course we have to do a dam. My business couldn't survive. How do you think I can give money to you? So let's start with you, because I know you had to work really closely with them. It's a different kind of institution.
Right. Yeah. And this was all very new for them. And it was relatively new for me. I've been coming fresh off of a lot of the courses that I've been taking for my master's in museum studies. And I did a lot of courses on digitization. So I kind of got won over really quickly on that. And then I was trying to kind of translate that for folks on the board and trying to sell this idea of like, oh, wouldn't it be so great to be able to look up things easily and to be able to make things searchable and make things accessible. That accessibility portion was, I think, what really won people over, because that gets to our mission, which is about making the artwork accessible. And given that physically it is difficult of access, and then when the pandemic hit, that really shut us down. So I thought, we've really got to make our collection visible, accessible, searchable, usable, essentially. And this is the way to do it. It's just, to me, it seemed very intuitive at that point. And essentially they kind of gave me free rein to go with that. And at that point I had also set up a studio intern program. So I had somebody else to talk to, because I feel like that's really important too, is to not be the only one, like I am right now, doing all the talking, but to get input from other people. And actually I'd love to hear more from other people here too. But just to be able to bounce ideas off and to make sure that you're not just kind of like going off in a strange direction, and have someone check you and go, have we considered this option? Or what about this? And that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of correlation between the Huntington and sort of how it is that we came up with the business case, and the buy-in specifically, and board members sort of absolute critical role in being able to advocate for. They may not necessarily be in the weeds about like, oh, R&R, that's just, like to get really into that level of granularity, I think is perhaps asking too much, but like as people to help us make that business case and understand in their own respective sort of day jobs, if you will, that this is something that's absolutely mission critical. That was something that we relied very heavily on in order to say, yeah, why don't we have that? Why can't we go ahead and survey across collections and see natural sort of connections between a botanical accessioned item with a painting that came into our art museum and, beautiful manuscript. And the fact that there was not a sort of easy way to get at that, and that it was largely built upon sort of these casual personal relationships rather than having something that is automated, that is sort of moving at the pace of work of the institution, was huge, I think, in terms of getting us to yes with our dam.
For me, I don't work very closely with our board, but I think one of the keys for us was being able to tie this initiative to our strategic plan, which we're currently in the middle of a 2018 to 2023 strategic plan. And I know that our board, like if we're able to demonstrate that something is critical to one of the points of our strategic plan, they're going to support it wholeheartedly.
That
Just
sounds like
keeping-
stepping back and getting the bigger picture, which is important.
I'm just keeping a little eye on the chat and the questions over here. And I've noticed that in the chat there's some questions about what's the difference between an RFP and a business case? And how do you use those in your organizations? RFP being request for proposal, if somebody doesn't know what that means.
Well, so we did something really idiosyncratic, which is why I'm actually sitting on my hands right now. I'm like, I don't know if this is something that's going to be useful, but just as a way to sort of kick off this conversation and perhaps answer the question, we actually ended up doing quite a few things just because there was also an opportunity to do some level setting and education, I would say, within the institution. So what we actually ended up doing was using sort of the needs analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying, like, what is the thing that we're trying to do, which is another sort of iteration perhaps of the business case that we built and have been building for the last couple of years, and made that into two separate documents. And so we did an RFD, which is a request for demonstration, because we needed everybody who would be evaluating and actually using the system on the Huntington side to really understand the capabilities of different dam products that were out there. And so we ended up distilling down our business cases into 3 or 4 different departmental specialized needs, and then releasing that as an RFD or request for demonstration so that we could see how each of the products demonstrated their ability to meet our business cases. And then after that, just because we needed to be extra, or I needed to be extra, I guess, we did an RFP, which is a much more formal request for proposal, and went much more sort of into the details of how exactly does this integration work? Will you support this, perhaps niche or emerging technology that we are interested in? And having something that's a little bit more specialized as opposed to a general user base, which is what the RFP was geared towards.
At the Manila, I would say, the business case that we created, that was an internal document to get the internal buy-in that this is what we should move forward with. And then once that is the decision, then we created an RFP, which if anyone would like to see ours, I'm happy to share it with you if you email me. So we created an RFP to send to select vendors to give them our specific requirements. And I think in the process of building the business case, we learned a lot of detail that then we could incorporate into the RFP.
Lovely. So I hope that explains a little bit more for the audience. If you're not sure where to start, the business case comes first before the RFP goes out to the to vendors, which is when you're actually ready to start looking at those solutions. So start with the problems, write those into the business case before you start going and looking for solutions. Definitely the way to go. And we've had a question about asking for how to find potential funders, and this kind of thing to talk about, which how do you, once you've written the business case, how do you then go about getting budget for the technology? And of course, this is always an interesting discussion within the cultural heritage sector, where budgeting and funding comes from very different sources than in the corporate sector. So did you have any interesting experiences with finding funding that you can share? If you can't share, that's all right too.
I'll share that in our case, the money for the dams came from the general budget. So once it was decided that we were moving forward with this, I submitted, hypothetical numbers based on what I knew about some of the leading vendors, and with the caveat that our accounting department knew that these were sort of placeholder numbers, and that we would have an RFP process, and that the end result might differ from these numbers. So I submitted that, and luckily it was approved, and then we were able to move forward with the RFP process, but it was just part of the general operating budget.
I was going to say that we did something similar to what Margaret did at Menil, which is to tie it absolutely into the strategic plan. Because there's so many things that if you pull it apart and are able to analyze it, it does absolutely speak to the need for, you know, a DBA, system administrator, some sort of consolidated or, you know, platform for all of these things related to digital assets. And so while we were able to tie it back to strategic planning and get it sort of on the docket, the funding actually came from gifts in particular. And there was one donor in particular, but there were two donors, I think, total, who were able to give us a very generous gift in order for us to make this happen. And it was very much built upon this idea of this is sort of in the life cycle of imaging, digitization, access, et cetera. So, you know, we were able to tie it that way.
Did you name the dam after them?
No, actually, so today we're closing the name poll for what it is that we're going to call it. And of course, there needs to be some sort of transportation tie-in because of our founder, Henry Huntington. And so I can't give it away yet because the poll doesn't officially close for another 5 hours, but there's a clear favorite. So yeah.
Oh, you will all look forward. I love hearing the names. You know,
Okay.
we all remember Liana Cave when she worked at Yum Brands, and they had this big contest. And what was it for Kentucky Fried Chicken? The bucket. And there are just so many creative names like that out there. It's also a great gathering point because people work hard. You know, look at the length of time some of these decisions take. Or Doria, you know, most of this was on your shoulders as we've talked over these last few weeks. And so it's good to have something that gathers a little warmth, a little humor. But I've often struggled with wanting to go to the boards and donors and family offices and say, look, it's really interesting that your family name is on a garage. How about the digital elevator? And I'm still struggling to come up with something catchy like digital elevator, which is not, because we can lasso. There's an impulse to want to help digitally amongst people who can, and foundations and family offices and among people. But it's hard. It's not a garage. It's not an elevator. So it's if somebody comes up with something clever, let all of us know, because having a concept like that can have good magnetic force to it. So
absolutely,
I can share. Oh, go ahead, Yvonne.
Oh no, I was just going to say it is all about that campaign of awareness, especially with adoption once we launch. So yes, anything in the way of good PR is appreciated. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I can share when I was working with the Royal Horticultural Society, so another botanical organization, they named their dam Iris because of the connection with the eye and perception and visuals and photography, and it really worked, and people loved it. They loved the name, and we even did a little mini celebration. We gave the person who came up with the name, I don't remember what it was, bottle of fizz or some brownies or something like that. But always good to celebrate these little wins. Do you have a name for your dam at the Menil?
No, but this gives me some food for thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hadn't gotten that far.
Not yet. Do you have some ideas?
Well, now it's got me thinking.
I do think there's been some very nice connection that the three of you have made between the use cases, let's start back one step, the assets that are in your care and in your trust, the use cases which govern what you need software to do, the weighting of those, which is sort of the who goes first, something that I think probably the Huntingtons been given just more than a passing moment of thought to lately. Because there'll be many people who want to raise their hands for taking care of whatever particular Excedrin bottle that something's aiming them at. And then tying the weightedness of that to how do we measure how we've done, and then to the strategy documents, just what you said, Margaret, about we're on this particular arc of strategy. The Huntington wrote an extraordinary document about its next 100 years. What's that, 2 or 3 years ago now, Yvonne, and it was an amazing document
Yeah.
And this nested so intimately with that. And Doria, I don't know if there was anything at that kind of level of a strategic, there were certainly organizational mandates that you shared with us. And I think tying asset inventory to weighting, to use cases, to measurement, to strategy is a winning, it outlines the conversations that executives like to hear when there are solutions in mind.
I find that it's been really interesting how the pandemic has driven and accelerated a lot of this process, because I was thinking like in 2018, 2019, oh, wouldn't it be nice to really go somewhere with digitizing things I felt like everything we had archivally and in terms of our collection, there were just so many different disparate pieces that weren't connected. There were physical pieces, there were digital pieces, that everything was kind of all over the place. And so I had it in mind, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice for these things to all be integrated, searchable, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just sort of a hazy thought. And then when the pandemic hit, I think I neglected to mention I'm a performing artist, so I did a lot of this part-time as the pandemic hit and all my gigs went away. And then I realized, oh, I can pivot really hard right now and make this my full-time project because I can. Because I'm not going to be performing. I'm just going to be right here. And I was like, this is the moment. This is it right here. I think it's that idea that people have a lot of, oh, let's save that project for a rainy day. Well, how about a rainy 18 months? Because that's really what we got given and I hate thinking of it that way, but in a terrible way, it was a kind of a gift, this gift of time and opportunity to just really focus very, very intensively in the first 6 months, I would say, of the pandemic, from March into the late summer. I was just I decided I just hit the ground running, and I was like, we're just going to do this. And I consulted with my intern. We got something in place. We moved up the whole process. It had been kind of gently gliding along, and I'd been sort of chatting off and on with the board. And then I was like, okay, now we have to start absolutely right now. We need to move fast. Nobody's going to be looking at our art until we get it into this format and we get it online. And so we're basically in stasis until this happens. So I felt like this urgency of time, and it happened. I mean, I said it happened. I mean, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of intensive work, but I had at least the building blocks to work with, which had been kind of sitting around and gathering dust, sort of metaphorically, on various hard drives or thumb drives and in different sources. And once that initial 6 months passed, and I had kind of the basis of a system to work with that was set up in our DAMs. And I didn't have that terminology at that time, and it's been kind of nifty. I've been picking up the terminology after the fact, which has been kind of neat too. But once I had it all set up at that point, then we were able to talk about, well, how do we integrate this more? How do we get this out more? Like, where do we go with it? And that's been kind of an interesting adventure as well. But of course, at the same time, there was also a lot of physical and analog activity in the space going on. And so there's always been this back and forth between what's happening on a physical level with specific artworks, and then what's happening with their digital presence and how they relate. So that's been the journey, that initial intensity of just getting to a kind of a foundational platform from which to grow from. And now I feel like we're at that next stage. And it wasn't something that I had planned out. We didn't have a strategic plan. We still don't have a strategic plan. That's something that I kind of fantasize about having. But looking back, it all seems kind of sequential. I feel like I could almost build a strategic plan backwards. I don't know how useful that would be.
And I think Doria, for you, probably some of this is now, it's a project for a snowy day, given where you live.
Absolutely.
Last weekend's big adventure in Boston.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I think part of what the three of you represent is, for institutions of any size, that the opportunity, and I'll use the phrase, to jump the curve, Look at the knowledge that we just get to listen to in these 40 minutes. It's remarkable. And whether one is sunsetting old stinky software or leaping forward to something that's never existed, the assumptive knowledge that we can do this, we know how to do this, there's reputable software out there, and we have 2 professionals here who offered to share their documents. And what this means is that we can accelerate the procedures for making this happen, because it has to happen. And regardless of the size of institution, and it's an exciting opportunity in this community. And COVID, how sadly, and has helped point the focus on the ability to jump the curve. We had over 2,000 people register for this event. And when we were in New York 2 years ago, we had 140 museum attendees, which was thrilling in person. And hopefully we'll have that many in New York in September. But the knowledge that the 3 of you have shared and Kristina's experience bear on the capability to jump the curve and move ahead and get those business cases written, because it's common. And we've all learned a lot about that.
I love that. I mean, the idea that no matter what size of the institution, no matter your particular sort of area of GLAM that you operate in, or your audiences, like, these are ambitious projects that we're talking about, but there are also ways that we can help one another. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are documents that certainly I'm willing to share. And so, you know, it's not insurmountable. It's just that there is a certain sort of logic to it, and having a clearly sort of idea of what is success and at what point you need to sort of roll back and, you know, follow the breadcrumbs back to the original sort of simple business case or the user journey that you had imagined, or whatever that may be. Yeah, it's absolutely doable, you know, so.
And sometimes picking up on other institutions' success, sometimes being able to show, you know, because, you know, especially with a board that maybe, or, you know, with individuals who aren't as used to working with this kind of technology or haven't seen it in action, even just giving them a chance to kind of, you know, to pull some good examples of other comparable institutions or institutions of different size, because I do feel that some of these digital and virtual tools are kind of, they have a leveling effect, because you can look impressive even when you're small. If you go digital, it kind of, it levels out a lot of that too. So if you have that opportunity to show people examples of what it looks like in other institutions, that can really be enticing too. That can make it more real.
I think to a surround sound to that, Doria, is it's also the private sector is so welcoming to be asked. And they love sharing with museums, and sometimes we'll provide resources and staff and all kinds of things if we remember to ask. And there's so much that we can learn in this sector from the private sector, and asking is pretty easy. There are board members, there are friends, there are principal donors and whatnot. And it's another thought I'd love to leave everyone with, that there's so much we can learn from the private sector, and they really like sharing. Sometimes they're even incentivized to share. When Douglas Hegley was at MIA in Minneapolis, he did a masterful job of taking advantage of the impulse of the corporate community in the Twin Cities to help with digital initiatives at MIA. It was something I learned a lot from. So,
I wanted to add in there too about the opportunity to talk about what happens and to learn from ourselves about what happens if we do nothing. And I think the past 2 years have been particularly shown a spotlight onto the lack of digital in some organizations, and this goes for cultural heritage as well as the private sector, and those organizations that hadn't made the business case for DAM and hadn't said, hey, we need to get this in order so that we can reach our audiences digitally, they've really suffered. And I think there's some interesting notes to take from that. And something that we can also put into the business case is the do nothing option, because we will get asked by our executives, well, you know what, we don't have money for it this year, so we're not going to do it. What are the consequences? What's going to happen? And I think we can all look back at these past couple years and see where potentially that's had some consequences on us.
Doing
So-
nothing is a choice.
Yes, exactly.
It's a choice with consequences, yeah.
Well, I hate to do this, but we do have to wrap up. It's been a lovely conversation, and I've really enjoyed speaking with all three of you. And thank you, David, for moderating this session with me as well. For anyone in the audience who still has further questions, please do reach out to our panelists. And if anyone wants to share in those documents, please do reach out to the panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and being so open and transparent and sharing with the community. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the conference.
Much appreciated. And we will segue now to hear the Cleveland Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art about all things STEM and museums from two of the real leaders in our field as we continue with the final session of the day. And on behalf of Henry Stewart, thank all of you and Christina for putting this together. We'll see you in the next session.
Thank you.